Audible is my road trip companion.
It's kind of my quiet alone time.
Audible is a routine for me.
It's like a fun night school for adults.
I could easily be seduced into locking myself in a place where I do nothing but listen to books.
I never was interested in historical fiction before, but I'm obsessed with it now.
There are a lot of classic and big titles that I feel like I missed out. Since I don't have time to read, might as well listen.
If I want to catch up on the news or history or learn what's going on in the world, I can download a book and listen to it.
Because I listened to her story over and over again, I made the decision to go ahead and follow my own dream, which was to help other veterans.
I think there's like 180 books in my library now. It changes your perspective. It makes you a different person. It's true. It's so true.
Download Audible and start listening today.
Hola, I'm Gustavo Arellano with the Los Angeles Times. I'm going to be moderating today's panel. Thank you all for tuning in for the 25th Annual Festival of Books and our virtual event, the Honorable Jerry Brown and Jim Newton, author of Man of Tomorrow, in conversation with me, Gustavo. Jerry Brown, of course, former governor of California. Jim Newton is a longtime LA Times man for all seasons. He's a professor at UCLA, Go Bruins, also author of well-regarded biographies on Ike Eisenhower and another former California governor, Earl Warren. A limited number of book plates are signed by both Jim and Governor Brown. They're going to be available with your purchase of Man of Tomorrow through Roman's Bookstore. And of course, books, the Festival of Books, it's about the book. So please do buy this amazing book that I absolutely enjoyed. So Governor Brown and Jim Newton, welcome to this chat we're going to have.
Thank you.
Good. Yeah, so wonderful, wonderful book, Jim. Even though it's big, over 400 pages, it goes just completely super smooth. And one of the things that struck me was at the end, you say that, obviously Governor Brown talked to you at length for this book, but he also did not read the book. He never asked and you never volunteered. So Governor Brown, have you read the book? And if so, what do you think about it?
Well, I read it. It certainly brought together a lot of things that I haven't been thinking about. So it's a story about California. It's a story about my political career, and real interesting. So I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Did you think Jim got you? In other words, you've been written about so much over the past 40, 50 years. Do you think he really nailed who you are?
No. And I don't think anyone has nailed. I don't think that is, well, I don't know whether it's possible or not, because you don't have a definitive nailing of anybody, because people have a range of expressions to their character, and there's plenty of interpretation depending upon what you're writing about in a person's life. So I think to really get the whole story here, I'd have to write a memoir myself, which I haven't done. So this is a good first cut. But I have many layers to my existence, my biography, and many more to come. So there's not only is this not the final chapter, but I would hope that there'll be some people listening here who may write a few more, for all I know.
Jim, fair critique?
I beg your pardon?
Was that a fair critique by Governor Brown of your work?
As fair as one could expect, I would say, yes. Listen, this book focuses on certain aspects of Governor Brown's life and his politics and his thinking. Is it the only set of things to look at? Of course not. But I'm pleased to be able to have pulled together what I did, and with his help and cooperation, for which I'm very grateful.
Yeah, no, it really is.
By the way, I do want to interject here. I would say that about anyone writing about my life. I've been very interested in, I don't want to compare myself to World War I, but reading a couple of books on that topic, I find out there are thousands of books writing about the same thing, or parts of the same thing. So I think human beings are the same in similar way. They're a whole world, a whole universe, and you can look at it in so many different ways. And so this is one very thoughtful, well-crafted, detailed aspect. But there's others, and then of course there's lots of other things that I might talk about, and there's all the things I've forgotten. But my memory will be jogged as I read books like this.
No, totally. And yeah, I was going to ask you about that, Jim. There's been so much written about Governor Brown. There's been books written about him while he was first term as governor in the 70s. There's been articles in newspapers. Los Angeles Times covered him, of course, extensively. You reported on him as a reporter. So what was a challenge for you in terms of trying to find something new that people would want to read about Governor Brown? And not just that, your former LA Times colleague, Miriam Powell, wrote her own biography of the Brown family, of Pat Brown, Jerry's dad, and his sister, Kathleen Brown. So what were those challenges, and what did you finally decide on? These are the stories I'm going to tell.
I think the story emerged from our conversations. There's just to say my conversations with the governor, in the sense that the more we talked, the more interested I was in focusing on some of the intellectual and spiritual guides that he reached to over the course of his long life and career. This is the first book, of course, to take the full measure of his governorship, since it came out shortly after the conclusion of his fourth term. So I knew that going in. I also knew going in that it was important to understand the first two terms in comparison and contrast to the second. Very rare that you have an opportunity to see a person in any life, especially a political life, with that 28-year gap. So I was interested in exploring more of what might account for the differences between the two sets of terms. Rich resources to look at, biographies of his father, of previous work about Governor Brown himself, and an endless supply of clips and interviews and whatnot. And so it was a formidable project for sure.
Oh yeah, and it's what's great about the book. It's also a history of California, my lord, and in Governor Brown's life and also his terms. You covered everything. You talked about the Tate murder, the Manson murders. You talked about Proposition 187. I totally forgot about the Medfly. I like to grow citrus as well, so there's always pests going with the Medfly. So much to cover, and since there was so much to cover, that's why I was surprised with your prologue. You started the book out of all things, opening day 1960, the opening of Candlestick Park, a baseball game. Pat Brown is there. Also, Richard Nixon is there. Governor Brown is also there. Why do you decide on that particular moment to open your book?
There's a little story behind that. Interestingly, I was interested in starting there. I've always wanted to start a book with the words play ball. So I've had a personal appeal. I grew up in San Francisco, so there's a personal connection to all of that. I liked the idea that it combined cultural and political moment. Nixon, Pat Brown, both there. And I had been working on that as the opening for over a year after Governor Brown and I started our conversations. And at one point I asked him, he had asked about the opening a few times, and I asked him if he could give me some sense of where he was that day. He was a student at Berkeley, as he can tell you, at the time. And he said, well, I was at the game. And I said, I'm sorry, are you kidding? I've been talking about this for a year, and you never mentioned that. And he said, I didn't know that was important. So it ended up being, for me, a much better scene because, of course, Jerry Brown was there too, not just Pat Brown. And he, as you know, if you read the prologue, he was there with Nixon. He has recollections of Nixon being there. And so, and recollections of his father being booed, and that has to do with the Carol Chessman case. So it wrapped together a lot of themes in the book, but I was already headed in that direction before I realized that it would include Jerry Brown in the scene as well.
Yeah, no, I love the memory that Governor Brown has of Richard Nixon offering a limp handshake with a hot dog in one hand and mustard. I can't remember if it was on his chin or on his tie. What else do you remember about that day, Governor Brown?
Well, I was just thinking as Jim was speaking, why, how much of it do I really remember? Because our minds play tricks with us. But somehow the mustard sticks in my mind from the hot dog. Somehow that juxtaposed with the president, or not the president, the former vice president, so because he was in private life at that point.
And then and it's sorry.
I do remember. There's one other thing I remember very clearly in driving to the stadium. I remember people, fans, as we drove through to try to get in the place where the governor's Lincoln limousine would let you off. It was a modest limousine, but nevertheless a limousine. People pounded on the windows, and they definitely didn't like the governor in a limousine going faster than them to get into the stadium. There was either a sense of egalitarian outrage, or perhaps the hangover from the Chessman case and other matters that had made my father at that point in time unpopular. So that feeling of a crowd pounding on the window, in fact, it did leave an impression on me. And at that point, I said, well, I'm not riding any limousines, particularly when I'm running for office. So that's was the origin of the Blue Plymouth, to avoid the limousine experience of people pounding on the window. I might say, going to another person that Jim wrote about, Earl Warren, if my memory serves me correctly, the Civic Center, new Civic Center built across from the Capitol, was named the Earl Warren Center. And then when Earl Warren was unpopular because some of his liberal rulings of the Supreme Court, I think they had a popular vote or city council, somebody, they stripped it. And so from that experience, I decided my name on no buildings. I developed the principle, you don't get things named after you, a bridge or a building, unless you're dead. And then I later refined that in my own thinking, that not only can you be humiliated by having the name removed, as we're seeing right now in San Francisco, they want to take out a building, Feinstein, they want to take out a school named after Feinstein Middle School, Washington, Lincoln. I mean, no one today is too sacred. We didn't know that then. The other thing I thought was some people get indicted. I mean, like Governor Kerner, who chaired the Kerner report, he was later indicted. So this whole notion of naming in public and how the public gets irritated or resentful of politicians, and the pounding on the limousine window, that was a very graphic message. Hey, be careful how you want to present yourself and how much adulation you want others to set forth, because there's always a real opportunity for that praise or that honor to become dispraise and dishonor.
You know, just
That
hearing
was the lesson
Governor.
what?
Yeah, no, I was saying hearing Governor Brown talk so much about like this one moment that other people might say, oh, they pounded on the windows, whatever, and he just took it so philosophically. And still, all these decades later, really, Jim illustrates so many of these moments, these philosophical moments, these moral quandaries that Governor Brown works on starting from a young man throughout his career. And so, I want to get back to what you said, Jim, about not just telling that biography of Jerry Brown, something that a lot of people know about, but also getting into the thoughts of him, like what works him. And I love the last line. I'm going to read it really quickly. The very, very last line in the book. You mentioned it earlier in the book, but I'm just going to pull it out right now. There's the acknowledgement. Life in the inquiry. I love that line. It says so much about how Governor Brown has lived life and governed. Explain where that line, life in the inquiry, comes from.
Well, I would defer to you, Governor. I got it from you.
Well, it comes from my experience as governor in life in various ways, that I came in contact as governor with a lot of advocates. And we know there's lobbyists, there are people advancing environmental causes, energy companies, transportation companies, unions, you name it, taxpayer groups. So there's advocacy. And then there's people who work for the governor, and some people by nature are advocates. Some people are managers. They like to manage, and they're not so moved or passionate about some cause. That's one distinction. But there's also a third category, different from advocate, different from manager, could be a manager, but also likes to ask questions. Well, what is the state of affairs? Now, advocates are really busy advancing their point for their client or for their belief. And so the nuances, the contrary evidence is completely uninteresting to the advocate. They only want to know what will help them make their case. The person who's driven by inquiry wants to know the truth. Well, what is going on here? What's it all about? And after you heard it one time, turn it over. and see if there isn't another way to look at the same thing. And so I've been moved by the third category, and I have a number of friends who are, I would say, live in the inquiry. We don't live in the inquiry 24/7, but it is a position, a stance, an orientation to life different than going along and following whatever ritual, status quo, whatever patterning. We all have patterns, and we all have habits, and we all kind of are driven by them. But at the same time, inquiry, another way to put it is curiosity. Children have such a curiosity that they might ask a question, why is grass green? And they'll ask
With that sort of thinking, Governor, why don't you just become a reporter? You sound like a reporter to me.
Well, that could be a reporter that has to live in the inquiry. Some reporters are, I've noticed, are a bit on the advocacy side because they like, once they get where they think they're at a certain point, they can start writing, they lose their interest in further inquiry. And I say life as inquiry never ends. And you never can rest on whatever your assumptions are. You have to rest on them in some way, but you really have to then say, but wait a minute, is that really the way it is? So it's a relentless inquiry. And I also picked that up when I was reading at Berkeley. I had a philosophy course, and I bought a book, The World is Will and Idea, by Schopenhauer. And somewhere in that book, he talks about interrogating himself, interrogating the truth of what is in his mind or soul. And he says you have to put yourself like on the rack, and you have to torture the truth out of yourself. It's so hard to obtain. So that would certainly describe a very vigorous life of inquiry.
Another journalism adage, if your mom tells you that she loves you, go check it out. So Jim, you hear this line, what strikes you so much about it? Life into inquiry.
Well, I think first of all, what struck me about it is how Governor Brown's commitment to that notion of really questioning and continuing to question and not settling on answers that would be politically easier to settle on, frankly. It's impossible for me not to emphasize how different that is than the experience of most people in politics. And one of the things that really impressed itself on me in writing this book is how different Jerry Brown is from most people who I spent my career writing about, which is to say people in and around politics. And part of that is that commitment, that relentless determination to follow his curiosity, to ask one more question, even when his staff has settled on it, even when the politics have coalesced around a certain answer, but to be willing to turn it over one more time and question it. I know a lot of people in politics, and I don't know anybody else who does that the way that Jerry Brown does.
What kind of approach then, and you write about in your book, but what kind of approach did that then lead for Jerry Brown in his politics and his governance specifically of California? Constantly asking, constantly just poking, and doing it in a way where, some people, I think with Brown, you could never say it was about him. Like other certain politicians, it seemed like he was reaching for that higher truth. So given that line of thought in politics, how did that influence California?
Well, I'll answer it quickly, and then I'll defer to the governor again. I think for one thing, it means that Governor Brown has consistently defied expectations. There are liberals who wanted him to spend more. There are conservatives who found him too liberal on certain issues. He questioned assumptions that one side or the other held steadfast to. He balanced a lot of budgets. He was not a tax and spend liberal, as he sometimes was accused of being, but more of a tax and save liberal, if there is such a thing. And so I think people outside of California misunderstood him greatly, especially in the first two terms. And I think even within California, he often surprised people by not taking a position that fit with their image of what he ought to be. And I think that's because he was relentlessly determined to question the assumptions beneath the arguments that were brought to him.
And you said that term, relentless. There's so many words that people try to use with describing Governor Brown: idiosyncratic, curmudgeon. We've heard them all, but I had never once heard this one right here, Relentless. And it just summed up when I read it, I'm like, yes, this is Governor Brown. It's right there in his biography. What drives your relentlessness, Governor Brown?
Well, I mean, anybody who succeeds in a career, whether you're building an automobile company or a software company or running for an office of some kind, or trying to attain a PhD or a Pulitzer Prize or a story, you have to have anybody who's successful has to be relentless. I was talking about a neighbor of mine. I was talking to a neighbor of mine yesterday, in fact, my direct neighbor who runs cows on my land here. And he called me back, waited a couple of days, and he's been harvesting. He harvested rice, harvested almonds, and walnuts. And he said for the last 7 weeks, he has worked every single day with his crew from 7 in the morning to 8 at night. Now, I'd say that's relentless. And that's what you got to do. Now, if you want to get to be governor, and you're going to get there by the time you're 36, you can't goof off. You can goof off a little bit, but at some point, if you want it, you have to go for it. I remember, and I don't know whether he told me this in person, I met Bill Russell a few times. And man, did I heard it about
Boston
him
Celtics
from
Center from San Francisco.
Bill Russell, because he was at University of San Francisco, USF, when I was at the sister prep school, St. Ignatius. Anyway, I learned, not when I was in high school, but later, about Bill Russell, that he would shoot 1,000 free throws in a day. He was just one after the other, after the other. That sounds pretty relentless to me. But so I would say the quality of persistence, perseverance, those are all similar to relentless. And I would say that it's, I think, perhaps, I don't know, it's a portent, and maybe it's emblematic. But my great-grandfather, who used to operate a stagecoach stop right where I'm sitting, on the very same land, particularly it was like 100 yards from him now sitting. And he left Hamburg, Germany in 1849 on a ship, a sailing ship, whose name was Perseverance. So I think that really set the tone, perseverance, which
early on, for sure.
Relentless.
You know, one of the surprises that I got out of the book, we nowadays, especially the people who weren't around during your first 2 terms as governors, we associate you with Northern California because you were the mayor of Oakland, you're up in Sacramento as attorney general, and also your second 2 terms of California. But your first position was actually your first politically held position for office was at Los Angeles Community College as a board of trustee. Could you imagine a world for yourself, an alternate reality where you stay in Los Angeles, say you become a supervisor, and from there you grow your power and end up being either senator or president or basically the other things that you were never able to achieve in your career?
Well, I did go to Los Angeles because I thought it would facilitate my advance in California politics. In fact, it would help getting elected governor. So I had a very clear idea in my mind when I moved from Northern California, where I grew up, and went to University of California. I went to Los Angeles. That's where the money is. 25, at least 50% of the voters in California watch Los Angeles media. So this was and you have a lot of the contributors. A lot of big money was there at the time, particularly Beverly Hills and other places. So this was an obvious. And I moved down, and this came up. There was no incumbents on the LA card, so I ran for it. But to fast forward, after 23 years, from say 1966 to 1988, I'd begun to grow restless about Southern California. I'd been so caught up in being governor and running for governor, running for president, going up and down from Sacramento to LA. I hadn't really experienced living in Los Angeles post-office, after I'd been in office. And I was living in Laurel Canyon, In fact, up on Wonderland Park, just above the road Laurel Canyon that goes over the mountain there. And it just seemed very quiet. I only knew a couple of my neighbors. There wasn't a lot of interaction. I had the feeling that I was living at Forest Lawn. It's just pretty quiet, trees, a lot of vegetation. I lived up a little road, totally isolated, but I got restless. Then when the chairmanship of the Democratic Party came up, it used to rotate north and south, and the southern chairman was just finishing, and the new chairmanship had to live in the north. So I said, oh, well, that's interesting. I'll just move up north, go to San Francisco again, where I still had a lot of friends. And so that's because I quite frankly was looking for an entry point, and chairman of the party was not a good one. And it's a good one because I learned a lot, but it's not a stepping stone to anywhere. It's too. That's a whole story on what being party chairman is or isn't. But so that's why I came back to the north. And in truth, I have many friends here from my days in the Jesuit seminary. I still have friends from high school and family members. And now that I come up to Colusa County, there's just a lot up here in the north. Just Sunday, I was at a little birthday party for one of my cousins, 92 years old. And halfway through the little, very modest dinner with 6 people there, they brought out a chair. And the chair was the chair that my great-grandfather, August Schuckman, sat in when he took a picture of himself in front of the mountain. The mountain is right here to my left. And so here we have, in the north, I've got the very chair that my great-grandfather, I have the photo, and it's an impressive photo. He's got a big white beard, and he's sitting in his chair, and we can tell from the markings. So there it is. In short, I have more connection to Northern California. Southern California, although I really enjoyed going there because of the vibrancy, the openness, the hustle, but I found a greater rootedness in the north, probably because I grew up there. I have a lot of memories, and I have a lot of relatives. I mean, many. I have 4 cousins in Colusa County right now. So then all those cousins are in their 80s and 90s, and they all have children, grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren. You add them all up, and you're talking triple digits. So that's a lot. If you look down to LA, I have a sister there. I have some nieces there, some grandnieces. But if we just look at the whole thing, I think I don't want to say it's fate, but my grandmother always used to talk about the mountain house, which is where I am now. I'm in the mountain house. Not the first one or the second one, but the third one.
Third one. That's how the book ends, on a scene of Jim painting that scene of the mountain house, of the solar energy, just talking about that. Jim, going back to the philosophical roots of Governor Brown, or most people know, of course, that Governor Brown for a time studied to be a Jesuit. He was a novitiate. And then people also know that during the 80s, he went and studied Zen Buddhism in Japan. But you also mentioned other philosophers like, I'm going to mispronounce him, but Ludwig Wittgenstein. Sorry, folks. Thank you. I'm more of a Sartrean myself.
Wittgenstein. Gustavo, you got your homework for you.
Camus, my guy. But talk about some of the other philosophies or philosophers, Jim, that you think really influenced Governor Brown that maybe the public doesn't know as much about.
Well, again, I'll let the governor speak to all of this. I think Illich, Ivan Illich, is clearly an important influence on the governor and his thinking and on him personally. I hope you all defer again to him on that. Schumacher, who wrote Small is Beautiful, which is an important book for, especially in the first couple terms, for forming the governor's view of the world and of the role of government in that world. There are other, certainly his experience with the Jesuits in terms of forming a way of thinking and a way of approaching issues. Foucault is someone we talked about, very difficult to read, but we talked about it in the context of criminal justice. So those are all people that we talked about, and there are many more. I mean, I've all just today we've heard from the governor on Schopenhauer. So I mean, he's a widely read, deeply read person. Again, unlike many people that I deal with in politics, and so that was revealing and challenging for me. I've read a lot of deep work that I either hadn't read from college, or hadn't read since college, or hadn't read at all. So it was a real learning experience for me too.
And one of the reasons for that, being in the seminary for 3.5 years, that's an experience. So when you're in the seminary, there's no dating, there's no going to movies, there's no television, there's no radio, there's no newspaper, there's no secular books, very limited array of literature and books that you're going to read, usually biographies of saints, Jesuit saints mostly. So it's a world where you can react to ideas and share ideas and think about them and question things. You don't question the doctrine, at least we didn't in those days, but it's not like, oh, let's go to the football game or let's pile in the car and go to the beach. It's a more cerebral, more intellectual, and of course, more spiritual life. But so ideas, I think, and books have a bigger role in my consciousness because during formative years, that was all there was. It was not all the excitement that you have in the normal existence. And I just think of two that struck me. One, Nietzsche. I don't know whether I'd heard about him before, but we were walking around, fellow brother Finnegan, we used to call, we were all brothers. And I remember we were talking within three, we had to walk in companies. We weren't allowed to just mingle and chat. You were assigned, you'd look as you walked outside, you see a card, and it would say Brown and Finnegan and Damrell. So those are your three, and you'd walk for 20 minutes. That's all you got. The silence was most of the time. You talked for maybe 20, 25 minutes after lunch and dinner. But as we were talking, this other novice said, hey, I'm reading or hearing about this guy called Nietzsche. And Nietzsche says transvaluation of values. Now, when you're in the midst of a very authoritarian, cloistered life where everything is laid out, it's clear, someone comes and says, no, what about it? There's values, and then there's transvaluation of values. I remember this was Brother Finnegan. He repeated it with great emphasis. And so that's really the life of inquiry. If you're going beyond your value, there it is. Now, another guy came by. This was a year or two after this, and he came to visit. A fellow novice. This was after the novitiate, my 3rd year. And he said he's reading a book by Albert Camus. And Camus talks about the absurd. And then he defined the absurd. He said the human heart is reaching out for meaning, and the universe is totally silent. It's that connection between human yearning for meaning and the absolute silence of the universe. That is absurd. And hearing that in the more orderly world that I was in, that was very exciting. In fact, it was so exciting that it wasn't too long after that I left and enrolled in Berkeley at the University of California in January of 1960, which was the beginning of student activism and all the rest that everybody knows about. So ideas had impact. Ideas had impact because there wasn't a lot of opposition to ideas. I mean, when I was in high school, we'd come after school and play basketball, goof off, and what have you. I think I read 4 books in high school because I remember there were so few. But when you're in the seminary, there's nothing else to do except pray, meditate, and read, and do manual labor, cleaning the hallways and fixing up the gardens and what have you. So that's where I really got to read out of necessity, because otherwise you just sit, what else can you do? So that's where ideas had a greater reality, because there was not the competing distraction of girls and football games and getting drunk or whatever. Like to do.
Yeah, Jim, Governor Brown famously at one of his last press conferences said he has no legacy. People do not remember the legacy of any California governors, even named Frank Merriam and George Deukmejian, I think. What is his legacy? What is Governor Brown's legacy? What is the legacy that people are going to get from by reading your book about Governor Brown?
And this is just picking a fight, but
That's why we're doing it.
I think you can call something a legacy. I think that's totally appropriate if you're the writer and you're looking at a life. What I don't believe is that as a politician, you can do things for purposes of building your legacy. I think you do what it is you're doing, and other people will characterize it in various ways.
And I would agree with all of that. And I do think partly the governor's negative reaction while in office to people talking about his legacy is that there's a way in which it can be a lazy question, and I'm not accusing you of that, but in the sense of, are you building the bullet train because you want a legacy, or are you building water tunnels because you want that to be your legacy? I mean, that feels like it's taking a public project and turning it into a selfish end, and I can understand why can be an offensive observation or assumption. That said, I do think there are things that Governor Brown achieved in his long governorships that people will be talking about for a long time, and therefore that it's a legacy. There's a lot we can talk about there: diversity in the state workforce, integrity in government, the sense of the appropriate role of government, whether government should be assumed to solve all problems or whether it should have a more restrained place in our lives. All of those, I think, are things that Governor Brown contributed to the conversation and politics of California. But the one I do think that will stand out 100 years from now is his leadership in the environment and climate change. No elected official of our time, or probably any time, has done more both to elevate the issue of climate change and to prove that it's possible for an economy to be successful and to address climate change than Governor Brown is. And so I think that's a clear legacy, and he can call it whatever he wants, but I'm going to call it a legacy, and I think it's a really worthy and important one.
Yeah, no, I would argue that as well. I mean, legacy to me is your actions will resonate, not just within you, but far away from you. So even something as like eliminating eminent domain, that has had a legacy on building in California over the last decade. The environment especially, that has had a legacy in the past decade. And Governor Brown, I have to challenge you, because if you really think that you didn't have legacy, then why would you have talked to Jim for this biography of his?
Because he asked me to. I didn't call him, he called me.
This is true.
So, it's not about,
And by the way, he didn't agree easily. So I don't.
I'm not going to ask that.
Look, here's my point. Jim, I think, made a good point about, are you building the bullet train for a legacy? No. I'm building a bullet train, first of all, because Arnold Schwarzenegger got $9 billion and got the project going. But secondly, I was advocating high-speed rail back in 1980 when I was governor the first time, because I liked trains, and I liked high-speed trains, and I thought it would be preferable to the high-speed missiles that Ronald Reagan wanted to put on railroad cars, called the MX missile, and move them around so the Soviets couldn't target them. I thought, well, that is not a good use of the railroad. We ought to move people, not missiles. So that's an idea that I've been attracted to for a long, long time. And it was strengthened when I went to Japan and rode on the train back in 1960, rode on the first bullet train. So this is something I like, I enjoy. I thought it'd be good. It's good for California. We ought to do it. It's a big idea. California is a big place full of boldness. So let's do it. So the word legacy, I think, comes in after the fact, maybe as an analyst or a commentator. But if you're on the field, if you're in the middle of the game, you're doing it. If you're a football player, you want to carry the ball or get that ball to the goal line. I don't think you're talking about a legacy. You may have
a lot of touchdowns make legacies.
Yeah, but You don't run a touchdown for a legacy. You run a touchdown to get to the other side. You're focused on the goal, and that's very immediate. People who are more in the commentator world, what I would call a secondary existence, they are looking to frame things to fit this secondary experience. But if you're in the primary experience, you're doing it. You're actually making something happen. And by the way, if you're constantly making things happen, you're not even ready yet to sit back and start characterizing them. The position I'm in now, I'm doing things, Climate Institute of Berkeley, Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, I'm the chairman of that. Oakland Military Institute, I'm the chairman of that. So we have all these, so I'm engaged. Got a ranch, got to fix the irrigation system. Get a week or two, we're going to get the olive harvest ready. We have a little disease called olive knot that I've got to figure out how you get it off the olive tree. So I've got a full menu, a full range of activity. Now, if Jim wants to go take a look at all this, he can write a second book and he'll get another legacy, which I will be very proud of. But
the olive legacy.
I've got to create the material. I'm in the business. I'm a content provider. I'm not a guy watching it. I'm creating it. Or what I like to say, I'm on the field, not sitting up in the stands watching somebody else.
You sound like a TikTok influencer now, Governor Brown. I'm going to ask just one more question, then we're going to show some pictures from the book.
I don't even know what a TikTok influencer is.
I'm glad that you don't.
Somehow I don't believe that. Jim, one of the things that I like about your book also, you would do like these little, like half a page sections that summed up big cultural moments that later on would, Governor Brown would touch. So you had one about baseball. You had one about the People's Temple and Jim Jones. You had one about the AIDS crisis in the early days. What was your reasoning for doing that?
Well, I had two ambitions with the book, and this is unfortunately a sort of long conversation, but really one was to tell the story of California from 1960 to the present, or roughly the 1950s to the present, and the other was to tell the story of Jerry Brown. In a certain sense, the first half of that preceded the second half. As has been mentioned a couple times, and thank you for it, I had written about Earl Warren. Warren left California in 1953 to become Chief Justice of the United States. And so when I was looking for another book project, I was interested in trying to bring the story of California into the present. And it's really only after having embarked on that quest and talking to a lot of people about it, did I realize that Jerry Brown would be the perfect person to build that story around, especially if you include his father's time. They really cover that entire period. So the idea or the goal of writing about California, it was equally a part of the launching or the idea of the book, as was the biography of Jerry Brown. So I was interested in then, once he agreed to talk to me and once we spent a lot of time talking, his role in that story grew and grew and grew, but it was always an attempt to try to tell both stories, and much of which I lived through as a reporter for the LA Times, and so a lot of that story, whether it's the riots or the earthquake or different events during that period, I grew up in California and remember the Johnstown Massacre and the assassination of George Moscone. So all of those stories were part of the story that I wanted to tell. And finding the way to integrate them with the story of Governor Brown was the big challenge of the book. And so I appreciate that you like that.
No, it was, again, a great book, very well weaved together. Folks, please do buy this book. Governor Brown, we're going to flash some photos right now. And if you could just walk us through what that moment was, what do you remember about that? So let's flash those photos, please. Here we go. Here's, what do you remember about this, Governor Brown?
Well, put it on again. I know what it is. That's Rabbi Heyer from the Holocaust Center. That looks like Tom Bradley. And that looks like the Holocaust, what's his, Jim, you can help me with that. The
Marvin Heyer?
No, the Nazi hunter from Israel.
Wiesenthal?
Yeah, Simon Wiesenthal.
I think that's Simon Wiesenthal, isn't it?
Huh?
But whatever it is, It's some kind of an event. I think it's on. If that is Simon Wiesenthal, that's what it's honoring. But obviously, this is an Orthodox ceremony. That's why there's no women there. The men are doing the dancing. That's what they do it.
Let's flash to the next photo now. I love this photo because there you got 4 folks ready. Like the rest of the country has always been interrogating Governor Brown. There he is on Meet the Press. What do you remember about that appearance?
Well, I'm trying to remember who are the 2 guys in the middle. I don't know who they are, but we know the guy on the side closest to the camera. He was a NBC reporter in Los Angeles. But what I remember is just Meet the Press. What I will say is to show you how things have degenerated. Now you have one reporter interviewing 4 or 5 candidates. It used to be the politician, the leader was the focus of attention. Now it's become more the media are the stars. I think that's, although you do have a lot of media, but you don't get on Meet the Press. It's rare that they have one alone. They always want to put you on with somebody else, put a little box and put people or more in boxes. So this was a time when it was a half hour. There was 4 reporters and one person. This would be very early on, I would say.
Jim wrote this great passage when you debated William F. Buckley, and Buckley, tried to go at you very snidely, and you were just so dexterous with the Catholicism going at that. So that was a great passage, Jim. Really like that one.
It's great. I encourage you to look at it for people who are watching. If you Google or go on YouTube and bring up William F. Buckley and Jerry Brown, you'll find it. It's a wonderful show to watch. It's also amazing the depth and of the sort of theological conversation happening on television. Pretty hard to, well, it's impossible to imagine with the current crop of politicos, but also just hard to imagine that kind of conversation happening on a network television show today in any context.
Yeah, definitely.
Right.
But one final photo, Governor Brown, and then we're going to get to reader questions.
Is very limited. Yeah, that would be, I think that's obviously, I think it's maybe in Maryland.
Election night.
The presidential campaign, 1976, Maryland, I would think. But not
do you regret never becoming president, Governor Brown?
No, I mean, I'd like to. I tried. Certainly I tried, but not to be. So I don't think regret, that's a pretty strong word. I mean, do I go around moping, oh my God, I could have been there? No. There's too much going on every day. That's like legacy. It's one of these dead concepts that betoken a dead life. Quite frankly, I'm looking forward to my olive harvest, as well as the Climate Institute, that we're actually, unlike most politicians who are fighting China, using that as the source of our problems, we're looking to collaborate with China, because as the biggest polluter, it needs to work with the second biggest polluter, called the U.S., and the most advanced climate government, which is California. So we're trying to find a pathway of cooperation in the midst of mutual recrimination and what have you. So that's where I see this thing as alive. This is not, we can regret when you do something bad, you have regrets. But if something doesn't work, try something else.
Yeah, like Rose Bird, for that matter. We're going to now go to some questions from the audience, and so if we could flash some up on the screen, we will commence. And I'll read them. Nancy writes, Governor Brown, when people speak of Calexit or secession from the U.S., how would you respond?
Say it again.
When people speak of Calexit or secession from the United States.
I didn't, this, like Brexit. You use the term as though it's common. It's a rather oddball term, rarely used. In fact, I don't think I've seen it mentioned in a long time. So you're talking about California departing the Union?
Yeah, there's always threats, and this is something that's been part of the state's history. Carve up California. California is ungovernable. in this case, make California its own separate country, or break it up. How would you respond to people who keep insisting on that?
Well, I think South Carolina tried that, and it didn't work out so well. Okay, so I don't think we're going to have a war with the Union, and we would have a war today. Now, maybe if things get bad and America keeps getting divided, there could be some breakdown. But right now, the center is holding, not well, but it's holding. And the idea that the Congress would allow California to leave is preposterous. They're not going to let it. They have a hard time just adding a state like the District of Columbia or Puerto Rico. That might happen, but it'd be a battle royal. So all this talk of the state of Jefferson, we see Jefferson flags all over the place. Not going to happen, but it's an idea, and people certainly in this part of California enjoy running flags and signs about the state of Jefferson.
Yeah, let's go to the next question, please.
Version of a secession.
Michael asks, given that taking personal responsibility for climate change isn't enough, what kind of policy and transformative technology should we bring into play and restore the world and render it, for all life forms, a healthier, more sustainable place?
Number one, the world needs renewable electricity, cheaper, more powerful batteries, more effective solar and wind, and possibly even small modular nuclear plants. That I don't know whether that'll work, but there are people who think it would. We have to generate energy without carbon emissions. That's number one. It's going to take billions. For example, the use of hydrogen as electricity or hydrogen as a fuel. One doesn't work and one's very expensive. But this is part of the future. We need a lot of technology in our buildings, in materials. We need a price on carbon. We need to rein in various kinds of emissions. So we need a lot of innovation. We need a lot of policy regulation and guidance, and we need market signals. And when you say we, I mean United States, China, India, Europe, Russia, South America. This is a matter that you can't solve by riding a bike and eating vegan. And it's a nice thing to do. And definitely we should reduce our meat content. But to go forward on climate change, we need a Rooseveltian New Deal, Grand Deal that can put a lot of people to work, that can, just take the simple thing of cars. I don't know, there are 100 million cars in California. There's over 1 billion in the world. Every one of those gasoline cars has to be replaced pretty quickly and made into electric or hydrogen cars. Then you got to find ways you don't need a car. So you have high-speed rail, or you have other kinds, light rail. There's so much technology, there's so much organization of our social lives, and there has to be a price on carbon, and some people don't like that. Some of the conservatives, oh no, that's a tax, and the liberals say, oh, you're permitting emissions, you should end them, and don't just put a price. So there's lots of political, economic, and technical challenges. They are formidable, but it can be done, and it must be done. We must get to zero net carbon by 2050, if not before. And by the way, we won't get all the carbon out of our economy, so we're going to have to take carbon emissions, CO2, methane, out of the air. We're going to have to sequester it and stick it underground forever. Now, that's a $1 trillion program right there. So there's plenty to do. And right now, sadly, America's thinking of a $2 trillion nuclear modernization when you can never, Reagan has told us, you can never fight a nuclear war and you can never win one. So why the hell are we spending $2 trillion to do all this? Plus,
do you agree with the Green New Deal that some Democrats are proposing?
I agree that the scope of the problem requires a response commensurate. And the New Deal, with the details, I'm not going to say I will agree with every detail. First of all, it's only a resolution. It's not an operational plan. But we need something not the same, but of the same magnitude. We're not going to get the job done without a huge reorientation of our economy and the world economy. And just to add a little note, E.O. Wilson, I was going to look for it, I have it right here. E.O. Wilson, the great naturalist, biologist from Harvard, has said in order to maintain just 80% of the species that now are alive in the world, we would have to leave half the Earth alone. Just don't occupy it. So if we have to have half Earth left for other species, and we have to get off of fossil fuel and all our fossil fuel cars, our gas ranges, all our coal plants, oil drilling, the whole 9 yards, that's a big jobs program. And that's why Biden says when he hears green, he thinks jobs. And wow, what a job it's going to be.
Now let's go to the fourth question, please. A question that was for Jim. There was a question for Jim on writing. Let's go to the next question, please. We'll get to, yeah, there we go. This is for you, Jim, by Lisa. When you spoke at the Festival of Books after writing your book on Earl Warren, you noted that research made you interested in Eisenhower, which was your next book subject. From your research and work with Governor Brown, do you know what your next subject will be for your book, next book?
That's the question that every writer dreads. I don't know yet. I am kicking around a couple of ideas for reasons that aren't really interesting to go into here. I'm not really prepared to move forward with anything at the moment, but I'm hoping sometime next year to be able to launch the next project. And my guess is that it will be rooted in California and in politics and culture, just because that's pretty much what I do. But exactly where I will take a cut at that, I will hope to work out between now and the end of the year.
Well, Jim,
go ahead.
I have to say, the word relentless comes to mind. If you got to write a book every couple of years, that's a relentless challenge.
Well, it's a joyful one, though, and
just to imagine it sounds like a lot.
Well,
I shrink
maybe
back
I'll write volume 2 of your biography.
Well, maybe,
yeah, you could write about his olive oil that he's going to be making soon.
I find op-eds challenging. They're only 800 words.
And we're almost out of time. So the last question I'll leave, and both of you I'd like to answer, just because, again, this is the LA Times Festival of Books. We're at a time where independent bookstores are struggling mightily. So I cannot overemphasize for the people at home, buy this book. It's an amazing book. So Jim and then Governor Brown, please tell people why should they buy this book.
Well, I hope people will buy it because I think it tells an important story about California and politics and a really important person who we're lucky to be with here tonight. And I hope that people will think about it now and think about how politics can be different and can be more uplifting and ennobling and intellectually satisfying and even spiritually fulfilling. And I think Governor Brown has shown that that's possible, and I hope that the book conveys that. Governor Brown?
It's a good read. It's interesting. My life has been pretty interesting. He's written about it. So, but also California is interesting. This is one of the most interesting places in the modern world. And it's been a very extraordinary period, going back to the 50s, the 60s. It's been a time of, I just happened to live, before World War II, post-war, then the 60s and the 70s. It's never stopped. Nixon's impeachment, the moon shot, Kennedy arriving on the moon when Nixon was president, and all that's happened since. So these are exciting times, and the best way to learn about them is through biography. And so this, I don't want to toot my horn. I acknowledge Jim here, but I think it's a good read. I think you'll learn something.
Yeah, no, an absolutely great read on an extraordinary man, an influential man, and someone, whether he agrees with it or not, has left his legacy on California. So Governor Brown and Jim, thank you so much for talking to me. Thank you so much for joining us at the LA Times Virtual Festival of Books.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for those of you watching at home. Sadly, the LA Dodgers right now are down 3-0. I know that's where you're going to tune into right now, right after that. But please join us for many, many speakers over the course of the next month. Go to latimes.com/FOB. subscribe to our newsletters, do all of that great stuff. So, of course, subscribe to the Los Angeles Times as well. Remember, please buy this book through Vroman's Bookstore in Pasadena, and one of the great cultural treasures of Southern California. Please do that. For the Los Angeles Times, I'm Gustavo Arellano. Gracias so much. Have a good night. And vote.
And vote.
So, good idea.